Hi all, thanks for joining. We're going to get started in 2 minutes, just giving some time for people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, thanks for joining this webinar today. Today we're going to be talking through the new afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation methodology developed by the Social Carbon Standard called SCM0009. In terms of the agenda today, we have an hour slot. It may be less time than that, but what we want to do is cover off a number of agenda items. One is just give an overview of what types of projects we're talking about and some of the research that we conducted in the area. Outline what the purpose of the methodology is and how it's different, and then delve into the eligibility criteria for the methodology, so what projects need to be aligning with, also covering off the key components of the methodology, which will be of interest, and also discussing briefly the public consultation, which is currently underway. And then we're allocating some time towards the end to go through a Q&A. So what we do welcome is any questions or comments to be dropped in the chat function, so that we can cover these off towards the end. It's also worth mentioning that, as I mentioned, this methodology is currently in its public consultation period, so we would really appreciate any detailed feedback or comments submitted through the formal channels. So if you go to www.socialcarbon.org and then go to the methodologies tab, in the public consultation section of that page, you'll see this methodology. And then when you click on that page, there will be an option to submit feedback, where you can provide just comments, or you can also provide an uploaded document to go into more detail. Ultimately, we want to get feedback from yourselves as to how this project could have implications for your own projects that you might be implementing, but also your broader comments and identify areas where we can enhance it further, so it's delivering real value and it's moving beyond a conceptual idea to making sure that it's being practical and how it can be used on the ground. So let's touch on what is afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation under this methodology. So in summary, it's activities that increase carbon stocks in woody biomass, and in some cases soils, from establishing, increasing, and or restoring vegetation cover through planting, sowing, and or the human-assisted natural regeneration of woody vegetation. We have split this into two key types. There's active restoration. So that is the direct implementation of activities. So we talk about manual planting, broadcast seeding to start or accelerate the recovery process of that forest. Or there's passive. So this is all focused on allowing the natural succession to occur in an ecosystem after removing the source of disruption. And these are two terms, and we provided definitions of these in the methodology, but we will be referring them quite regularly. So good ones to be aware of. So before we jump into the methodology itself, one of the key findings we found in the report we published last year when looking at afforestation, reforestation, was whilst there is a growth in afforestation activities and a growing number of projects planting native species, a lot of them weren't aligning to published best practices. They weren't planting a broad range of native species, and there was opportunities for improvement. And in some cases, if we look at the bottom right, a large number of projects were exclusively planting exotic species. So we felt there was a real need to provide a methodology to help provide greater guardrails for projects and drive that higher quality. Why do we need native restoration? So this slide really summarizes that in its core essences. One is that we really need to restore what's been lost. So in 2022 alone, we lost over 22 million hectares of tropical tree cover. We've also got a biodiversity crisis in parallel to climate change. So since 1970, we've lost around 70% of abundance of mammal, bird, reptile, fish, and amphibian species. But also nature and restoring it offers at least 1/3 of the greenhouse gas reduction needed in the next decade. And doing activities which are going to improve nature's ability to absorb emissions has been flagged by the United Nations as key to addressing climate change. If we then touch on the high-level purpose of the methodology, we had 3 core goals. One is to facilitate native restoration of forests worldwide and support the implementation of projects that not only are going to have a positive impact in terms of restoring lost forests and degraded land and restoring it most akin to its native conditions, delivering broader biodiversity benefits with that beyond additional ecosystem benefits, but also have a methodology which by default aligns projects using it to industry best practices, so that by default buyers of carbon credits generated by projects using this methodology are confident that they are high integrity, high quality projects by default. And also that the third piece was to provide a more robust monitoring approach to measuring the results from afforestation, reforestation. I'm going to just be referring it to ARR probably for the rest of the session. And what we previously had was the CDM afforestation methodologies, which were really valuable and had been well tested and used by the market for several years. But we felt there was a need now to transition to the next stage, where building from the learnings of the CDM, create a new methodology which utilizes and takes into account the latest science and sets higher thresholds for projects to align with to, again, drive that higher quality. So in summary, how is it different from others? So I suppose the first piece is that the eligibility criteria and the requirements that projects need to align with aligns with industry best practice, and we looked at multiple sources as to what that best practice looks like. And we embedded that into the methodology so that projects will be aligning with that by default. We have a particular focus on native species. So we'll be covering that off in a few slides from now into what those specific requirements are. But we believe it's one of the first methodologies to have that real native species focus. But also it uses dynamic baselines where applicable. Again, there are exemptions, but we're using dynamic baseline when there is a high likelihood that natural regeneration would have occurred. So you may be asking, what does this mean in the detail? So the next slides will help go through that in more and provide more clarity on that side of things. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, for anyone who's just joined, we will be planning to have a Q&A session towards the end of this session. So please drop any comments or questions on the methodology in the chat so we can have a look at those and answer those at the end of the session. But again, we really do want to get some detailed feedback and comments, so please also submit that feedback through the formal process, which can be found on the website. So in terms of the applicability conditions, We have the general conditions, but also project type specific conditions. What I will do is first just cover off the general. So what we're looking at is projects that either include active and or passive restoration to increase vegetation cover. They can't occur on tidal wetlands or on organic soils or wetlands that alter the water table. So in the case of a mangrove restoration project, that would be using our mangrove specific methodology, which is SCM0009. In cases where invasive species are found within the project area, the project is going to be required to implement measures to remove and manage those species. Ultimately, that will be important to help deliver the native restoration ambitions of the project. And also, the project proponent will need to demonstrate that they have plans in place to stabilize the carbon stocks after the project's planned duration. So if a project is only planning to operate for 100 years, it will need, for 30 years rather than 100, it will need to have evidence that either the project is going to be financially sustainable after the end of the project duration, it has plans to get certain legal protection to protect that restored land, or it has capacity building that facilitates the long-term carbon stock stewardship. Now, under social carbon, what we have is 10-year crediting periods. So there is a high likelihood that projects may initially set out a duration of, say, 30 years, but after doing 2 renewals of their crediting period, they may want to extend that further. So that will also come into play in this perspective as well. In terms of soil disturbance, we'd primarily look at site preparation, for example, for this. So if this only occurs once during the project crediting period, so at site preparation, or we ideally don't want it to cause significant soil inversion beyond a depth of 25 centimeters, which would have typically occur with the use of, for example, a moldboard plough. If either of these do occur, then the project would be required to also measure soil organic carbon as a carbon pool to be able to track and account for that in the project's net accounting for greenhouse gas benefits. If we then go to specific project type requirements, so we have two different splits here. We have just the core afforestation, reforestation lens, and then also the agroforestry lens. Again, what we have right now is the drafted requirements. We are in public consultation. This may change. The more feedback we get and the more context we get from different project developers, the more insights we can have to refine this if it's not going to completely work for the majority of projects. So again, this is why we wanted to run through these during the session, have this webinar, but also really promote people from sending their feedback through the formal channels. So it enables us to review them, understand different contexts of projects, and potentially make some refinements of this to make sure that this methodology is going to be able to deliver value on the ground. So we're going to go through each one. Let's start off on the afforestation, reforestation lens column here. So we're looking at 100% of the species being native, with no species representing more than 50% of total individuals planted. In terms of the minimum number of native species planted, in temperate climates, that would be 4, tropical, that would be 15, and dry climates, that would be 4 as well. Note, we do have an exemption that we are conscious that some ecosystems have fewer species within them, and some species dominate naturally. So if a project can provide clear rationale for that, then there may be exemptions from this minimum number of native species planted. In terms of the sourcing of the seeds and seedlings, 80% needs to be collected within a 250-kilometer radius of the project area. And no harvesting of timber products is permitted unless it is aligning to best practices for forestry or it's for maintenance activities. In the case of agroforestry, we're looking at 60% of the species planted needing to be native. with no species representing more than 40% of individuals planted. In terms of the minimum number of native species planted, we're looking at 2 for temperate climates, 8 for tropical, and 4 for dry climates. Again, if there are specific ecosystems where fewer species dominate, this criteria may be able to be excluded by the project, if provided they can demonstrate clear rationale and evidence to support that. In terms of sourcing of seeds, it's the same requirement for afforestation, reforestation. 80% collected within 250 kilometer radius of the project area. And then in terms of harvesting, we're currently looking at a maximum of 10% of the total trees after 20 years, or again, following best practices for that specific area. And if it is for profit, it only needs to be for community profits as a sustainable income source, or to continue and help finance the continuation of the restoration activities. Now, we are conscious that some some species used in agroforestry, such as coffee, are harvested and replaced once they start reaching maturity and their crop production significantly declines. So in the case of coffee, that's often 20 to 21 years. And we have, again, added exemptions if they can provide evidence, when I say they, the project developers, that this is required. If that is the case, then they would need to account for that harvesting and loss of carbon stock stored using the long-term carbon benefit, which is a general requirement for projects utilising harvesting. Again, if you have any comments or questions, please drop them in the comments section so we can cover them off in the Q&A session, part of the session. Looking beyond the applicability conditions, it's also worth mentioning some of the broad and general afforestation, reforestation requirements that are documented in the SOCIALCARBON standard, so version 6.1 requirements. So projects will still need to demonstrate that the project area has not been cleared of native ecosystems within 20 years prior to the project start date. In the case of this methodology, again, this will still need to be demonstrated unless they can provide evidence that the prior clearing was conducted by actors with no relationship to the project proponent or landowner. And that would be by typically community surveys or law enforcement records. The other requirement, which was where the project is exclusively focused on afforestation, reforestation, 60% of the species planted must be native. Again, this methodology is extending that further for both agroforestry and for afforestation, reforestation. We also do have a requirement around species planted. So we want to see a minimum lifespan of 60 years. And if they don't have a expected lifespan of 100 years, then the project needs to calculate the long-term net carbon benefit of the project, because a social carbon credit represents 100-year permanence from a CO2 perspective. And therefore, if that species isn't going to survive that duration, then that needs to be compensated for. Or the project can demonstrate that it has plans to replant those trees when they reach maturity. Again, that's going to be required for all projects. This is one of the areas that we do want to get some broader feedback as well from the project developer community and the broader market stakeholders to understand if this is reasonable, if this is going to be practical on the ground. Because again, we are also looking to release an update to the standard, and this insight and this feedback does help us with those requirements. In terms of lifespan, we're looking at evidence from at least 2 source or peer-reviewed literature or government published reports to justify that. Again, we're welcome to feedback on that to understand how practical that will be on the ground. If we then move on to the key components of the methodology. So we have 2 different zones. One is the passive restoration zone, and this is the area which is most likely to have natural regeneration occur. And this was through review of peer-reviewed literature that Typically, this happens less than 200 meters, but to be conservative, we set that threshold at 200 meters. And then we have the active restoration zone, the zone where there's a very low probability that natural regeneration would have occurred because of its distance from the native forest. So where projects are purely looking to do native, purely focused on passive restoration, so again, promoting natural regeneration, a performance benchmark will be required, so a dynamic baseline, to assess whether the results achieved by the project would have occurred in a business as usual condition. And we'll be touching on the dynamic baseline approach shortly. Projects that go beyond that, so planting in an active restoration zone, don't need to use dynamic baselines, but they will need to account for the baseline carbon stocks and vegetation on the land. If a project is doing a blended approach where some of the project area would be in a passive restoration zone and some of it would be outside of it, you would need to demarcate in your documentation the different zones for the project. So if it was a pure active restoration or active restoration project, but it was still planting within that passive restoration zone, it would need to use that performance benchmark. Unless, and this is the key aspect, there is an exemption for not having to use the performance benchmark if projects can demonstrate that no natural regeneration has occurred in the area or been sustained in the 10 years prior to the project start date. And this excludes clearance of vegetation less than 3 years prior to the project start date. So what we're trying to say here is if there is clear evidence that there has been no natural regeneration on this land and it hasn't been sustained, then there wouldn't be a need to have those dynamic baselines. The reason for is, again, we found in the literature that there are lots of biomes where there may be some passive restoration, but that natural regeneration isn't surviving and typically will turn over and the carbon stocks will be lost again. So we wanted to add this to add flexibility to project developers. In terms of pre-existing biomass, so there may be situations where there is pre-existing woody biomass on the planting area at the project start date, so T0. Now, any removal of pre-existing woody biomass needs to be estimated using the stock difference method. So they'd do a look back period just to assess, okay, was there any woody biomass cleared from this land in the last 10 years? And if there was clearing, the project proponent would need to demonstrate that clearing was not conducted to generate greenhouse gas credits. So what we don't want is a scenario where landowners or projects are deliberately clearing the land in order to generate more carbon. So there are some evidence that needs to be provided. One, if that clearing was done by natural disturbances such as fires, hurricanes, or floods, that could be an exemption. If the biomass was cleared because it was invasive and not native to the project area, so a good example of that would be if it was a commercial eucalyptus plantation in Brazil, for example, and it had to be removed because the native vegetation wouldn't be able to grow and achieve the key outcomes of the project with that being present. So again, it would need to be removed to support that native restoration. If that was the case, and we have it down here in point 2, that removal of those baseline carbon stocks needs to be encountered in the first year of the issuance. So there will be a deduction from projects for doing so. Or the third piece is if the project has or the woody biomass was cleared by actors with no relation to the project developer or the landowner. Again, that would be via community surveys or law enforcement records. If a project can't demonstrate any of the 3 above, and there was clearing of vegetation prior to the project start date, then the project isn't eligible. So those are really important areas to be assessed. Onto the dynamic baseline. So what we have is performance benchmark, and we've tried to align this to practices applied by other standards to ensure that consistency, but also provide some further clarity in areas. So this performance benchmark needs to be conducted and calculated at T0, and also when new instances are added to the project in the case of grouped projects. So every project will need to select project plots via representative sampling. And then for each project plot, you will then select a matched control plots. And those are from a donor pool using a number of variables to help match those areas to the most representative in your project area. You will then also use continuous matching covariance, such as stocking index, on those prospective control plots. And then you select K control plots most closely matching the project plot. And then what you're doing is for the sample population of matched project and control plots, you're evaluating the match quality and then finalizing the matching. And then you're using that to add a discount to any results achieved in the project plot to compensate for any natural regeneration that's occurred in the control plots that are most comparable to your project area and the specific project plots. So it ensures that if there is very similar, or if there is natural regeneration on land which is very similar to your project land under very similar conditions, then that is discounted for to demonstrate the most likely baseline scenario. In terms of the donor pool, so we have a number of requirements. So one, it needs to include areas within the same ecoregion, so biome level as the project. It needs to have the same policy environment as the project area. Outside this, it also needs to exclude other follow projects. So excluding, for example, other afforestation projects, whether SOCIALCARBON or under a standard. Has to have similar land tenure for that and land tenure classifications, and typically that would be attained through published or official government sources. And in terms of proximity of the project, we're looking at areas within a 100-kilometer radius of the project area, with the project area being at the center. Now there is requirements or details in the methodology which detail if you can't, if there's a lack of control plots within that radius, be able to expand that. So I would recommend reviewing the methodology to delve into that in more detail. So those are the core aspects of the methodology. Again, I would highly recommend reviewing details on the methodology and the methodology itself to delve into kind of the finer print. But again, we are running a public consultation. What I've been presenting is the initial draft and the proposed approach. It may likely change if we get feedback from our stakeholders that certain aspects need to be changed or further clarity is needed. So this is a great opportunity for you to send that our way so we can see different insights, different contexts for different project types, and really help us enhance what we've currently drafted. The public consultation is currently underway. So that was between the 28th of February and it ends on the 28th of March. And again, if you go to the SOCIALCARBON website and the methodologies page and you find SCM9, there is a button where you can then submit your feedback, both text and also uploading documents to support that as well. So we really do welcome all feedback from that perspective. As I said, we might not need the full time, so we're now going to jump into the Q&A section where this is an opportunity to send in your questions and also kind of ask anything that you want in regards to the methodology. So let me have a look. So Keegan, going for the first question up. So best practices in forestry. So again, this will largely depend on different regions. We've kept this fairly broad, and again, it would be up to the project developer to provide evidence as to why that would be best practice in their area, and for the project type they're including. Again, what a useful feedback would be is if you feel that further details, or we need to be more explicit as to what our expectations are regarding definitions of best practice, we are happy to add that in. But we felt that because it will vary from different areas, we would leave that open for the project developer to demonstrate that. But again, feedback on that is useful for us to refine that further. There is one question from Natalia, which is, can you please clarify why the project area shall not be cleared of native ecosystems within the 20-year period prior to the project start date? For instance, if I cleared my property 20 years ago and it has been utilised for livestock purposes ever since, would it be ineligible for an ARR project to be conducted there, as it was cleared of native ecosystem within the 20-year period prior to the project start date? Okay. So the primary reason we added this is to prevent perverse incentives whereby landowners that have cut down, for example, native forest on their land, sold that for profit, sold the timber for profit, and then within a relatively short period, then be able to generate carbon for restoring that forest, which they shouldn't have cut down in the first place. So other standards have a 10-year period for this. We deliberately put 20 years because we felt that was enough to really prevent that from occurring. In the case of Natalia's example, so if she were to have cut down a forest in her project area 21 years ago, then that area would then be eligible for restoration. In reality, it's most likely that she wouldn't have been the person that had cut it down, but again, there could be scenarios where she'd done so. So that time period means that there's enough time for her to, or less incentive for her to have done that from a carbon perspective. So in that case, if she'd cut it down 21 years ago, she would be eligible from a year ago now, so after 20 years, to then start planting on that land again and generating carbon from that. Please send through other questions as well. We've only had 2 so far, so I'll give people a few minutes just to send those questions through. If not, we can finish the session a little bit earlier. But please, I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes. So retroactive crediting period. So this is more of a general standard question. So at present, we have 3 years, I believe, is the maximum crediting period that projects can claim for, but they need to have been validated within that 3-year period. So Maria asked, how is the baseline, for example, of a eucalyptus? What is the baseline discount? A long-term average of the previous 10 years. For instance, is eagle scrub. So let's say there's 2 scenarios. There is one, there's a eucalyptus plantation. And then 2, there's just a general shrubland. So if it was a eucalyptus plantation, you would calculate what the carbon stocks of that plantation are per hectare. And then you'd deduct that from the project. So again, if that entire plantation is being cleared, the carbon stocks stored in that plantation need to be discounted for in that first year. So it may result in a significant decline in that case. If it is a shrubland, for example, what you'd be using is the IPCC values for that shrubland in that area, for example, and then discounting from that from the first crediting period as well to reflect or to prevent those credits being accounted for in the first issuance and for subsequent crediting period. So Alan's asked, could you please clarify this point related to eucalyptus area that you mentioned? If a landowner has a eucalyptus farm, he wants to start a carbon project, is it possible to clear all eucalyptus trees to plant native species? Yes, it is, but they need to discount for the loss in carbon from that eucalyptus plantation. It also depends on whether that eucalyptus plantation is native or not. If you had that in Australia, it may be considered native. If it was in Brazil, it definitely wouldn't be considered native. So regarding next question, so how is the longevity? Is it expected the plant to stay for at least 100 years? Is it the same for agroforestry or a shorter longevity? So social carbon, when we talk about a social carbon credit, the permanence of that is 100 years. So to deliver that, projects can technically run up for 100 years. So what we have is 10-year crediting periods, which can be renewed after every 10 years, up to a 100-year period. Now, we are conscious that there are some projects that may not be able to continue operating or generating carbon after, say, 40 years because the vegetation they planted has reached maturity and just isn't sequestering any more carbon to generate those carbon credits. So there would need to be provisions implemented by that project to maintain that the forest that is restored, whether that be building sustainable livelihoods with the local community to help maintain that area, or it could be legal protection on that land. What we also have in the standard itself, rather than this methodology, is the requirement for species longevity. And the reason why we added that is we were conscious that there are some species which don't have long lifespans, and that wasn't being accounted for in other standards and other approaches, whereby a species may live for, say, 40 years and then die off. But it was being assumed that that species and the carbon stored from that was going to stay for 100 years, which just wasn't adding up. So adding this requirement was going to, the design of this requirement is to compensate for that, so that projects can demonstrate that they have species that are either going to survive for that 100-year period, or if it's less, then they have provisions in place to replant those species if they mature and die off. Again, we really do need to get feedback from the community as to whether this will be practical on the ground. Our focus is making sure that the results delivered by projects using our standard are robust and have permanence. So it's obviously a balancing act from our end, but getting feedback from people on the ground as to the practicality of this is really useful. So again, this is another area where we would really welcome some feedback because we are refining our standard further, and this may be a topic we want to refine in the latest version we're working on. Any other questions? So Laura has asked, a plantation based on ecological succession, so percentage of pioneer, secondary, and climax species must apply the long-term benefits since pioneer species are important in the ecological system but have useful life of less than 60 years. Yeah, it's a very good point. Again, feedback on the general requirements regarding afforestation in the standard is useful for us to make sure that we're one, supporting projects in actually implementing impact on the ground. Next question. What do you consider as the main points that differentiate the methodology from other standards, and what are the main drivers of improvement? So we did touch on this a little bit earlier. So the three core areas were What we've done is looked at best practices in terms of afforestation, reforestation from multiple sources, and embedded that into the standard. So projects are aligning to those by default. We are utilizing baseline dynamic baselines where applicable for different project types. So moving ahead of what was previously required under, for example, the CDM methodologies. And we've got a particular focus on native restoration and native species, which is different from others. So we have found in other methodologies, they kept the percentage of native species fairly open. And we felt to drive high quality and make sure that every project using this methodology were by default quality, we felt it was needed to add those requirements explicitly into the methodology rather than be a decision that was made by the project developers. I'll give it a few minutes for any remaining questions to come in. If not, we'll finish there. Let's give it a minute or two. I'm assuming, I don't want to be too early, but I think we have got no more questions. So we'll finish it off there then. Thanks all for joining. What I will do is we'll upload this recording as well onto our site so people can rewatch it. Again, really looking forward to getting feedback as to the methodology and specific comments in the context of your own projects and experiences to help make this better and enhance it further. So again, thank you for joining. There's some really good questions as well. And we look forward to seeing projects utilizing the methodology in the near future. All right, thank you very much, everyone.